Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that an unelected group of bureaucrats, people you never voted for, people most Europeans couldn't even name if you asked them on the street, just tried to reshape the future of global free speech with a single decision, not with a debate, not with a vote, not with a public conversation where citizens could weigh in, but with a punishment exceeding $100 million aimed at forcing one platform to hand over unprecedented amounts of user data and to quietly censor political speech it doesn't approve of. And here's the twist. The blowback was immediate, the ripple effect was global, and the reaction inside Europe wasn't just anger, it was awakening. In today's conversation, we're going to unpack what the European Union just did, why it's backfiring spectacularly, how this mistake is drawing millions of Europeans toward uncensored platforms, and how this is turning into one of the biggest free speech battles of the decade. By the end, you'll understand exactly why this is more than a fine. It's a turning point. A turning point for Europe, a turning point for the United States, and a turning point for the future of open conversation online. So let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter here. The European Commission, which is the executive branch of the European Union, issued a fine somewhere in the range of $120 to $140 million against the social media platform X. Now, you might be thinking, well, companies get fined all the time for breaking rules. That's how regulation works. But this fine was different. This wasn't about a safety violation or a data breach or some technical failure. This was about refusal. Refusal to share detailed identity information about users. Refusal to hand over control of who gets verified and who doesn't. And most importantly, refusal to quietly censor political speech that the Commission found inconvenient. Think about that for a moment. The penalty wasn't tied to harm caused. It was tied to non-compliance with demands that would fundamentally change how information flows. And for folks our age, people who remember when newspapers competed for subscribers by earning trust rather than government approval, this should set off alarm bells. Because what the EU is essentially saying is this: if you want to operate in our territory, you don't just follow safety laws, you follow our editorial preferences. You let us decide what your users can say and who gets amplified. That's not regulation, that's control. Now, the Commission's official explanation was wrapped in language about transparency regulations and digital safety acts. They said the blue verification checkmark was deceptive because anyone could pay for it, and that the platform wasn't providing adequate access to researchers who wanted to study misinformation. But let's pull back the curtain on what those words actually mean. When they talk about transparency, they're really talking about access. Access to who's saying what. Access to private user information. Access that would allow government-aligned groups to identify, track, and pressure individuals who post things the establishment finds uncomfortable. And when they talk about misinformation, they mean information that contradicts official narratives, whether those narratives are about migration, energy policy, or political candidates. This isn't speculation. We know from the timeline of events that the EU began auditing the platform shortly after it was purchased and transformed into a space where diverse political opinions, including conservative and populist voices, could actually be heard. Within months, warning letters arrived. Then came charges about letting disinformation run wild. Then an attempt to block a live interview with a presidential candidate during an election. Each step was escalation, each step was pressure, and each step revealed that the real issue wasn't safety or transparency. The real issue was loss of control over the public conversation. So why now? Why is the European Union suddenly so aggressive about this? To answer that, you have to understand what's happening on the ground across Europe. For decades, most Europeans got their news from a relatively small number of sources: state broadcasters, legacy newspapers, outlets that, whether intentionally or not, tended to align with the priorities of political elites. But over the past few years, something remarkable has happened. Millions of Europeans have started getting their news from platforms where the information isn't filtered through political gatekeepers. In somewhere between 10 and 15 European countries, X has become the #1 news app. That means every single day, more people in those countries are opening an app where they can see unfiltered commentary, raw debate, and perspectives that would never make it onto the evening news. They're reading posts from journalists who've been deplatformed elsewhere. They're seeing videos from citizens documenting things mainstream outlets won't cover. They're engaging in conversations that, just a few years ago, would have been shut down as hate speech or misinformation before they even started. And this terrifies institutional leadership, because for the first time in decades, their narrative monopoly is disappearing. It's not that they've lost influence entirely, it's that they no longer have exclusive control. And when you're used to setting the terms of every debate, when you're used to being able to silence dissent by simply refusing to cover it, the emergence of a space you can't control feels like an existential threat. So they responded the way institutions always respond when they feel threatened. They try to force compliance. But here's what they didn't anticipate. When you make compliance the price of operation, you're gambling that the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of surrender. And in this case, they were wrong. Because we refused, we didn't quietly agree to hand over user data, we didn't secretly implement censorship filters and hoped no one would notice. We didn't take the deal. And that refusal, that public refusal, did something powerful. It exposed the game. Think about how rare that is in modern politics. How often do you see a major corporation stand up to government pressure and say no? Most of the time, companies fold. They issue statements about respecting local laws. They make quiet adjustments behind the scenes. They calculate that cooperation is cheaper than confrontation. But this time, the response was different. And the reason it was different is because the stakes were understood. This wasn't about one platform or one fine. This was about whether the future of online speech would be determined by users and creators, or by unelected commissioners in Brussels. Now, let's talk about the 2-year campaign that led to this moment, because context matters. The pressure didn't start with this fine. It started almost immediately after the platform changed hands. In the summer of 2023, the European Union conducted an audit and flagged the platform for not properly handling hate speech and disinformation. 5 months later, they issued a formal warning letter claiming the platform wasn't stopping the spread of misinformation. Then, during the height of the American presidential election, they charged the platform with letting disinformation run wild, specifically pointing to pro-Trump rhetoric, as if supporting a presidential candidate is somehow grounds for regulatory action. 1 month after that, they tried to prohibit a live and important conversation. Just think about that. A foreign governmental body attempting to interfere in American political discourse by blocking a conversation between two American citizens. Then after the election was over and a new administration was coming into power, the EU ramped up its investigation, clearly trying to build a legal case that would finally bring the platform to heel. And now, here we are. A fine exceeding $100 million, an unprecedented penalty designed to send a message, comply or pay. But something remarkable is happening in response. Instead of compliance, there was resistance. Instead of silence, there was amplification. And instead of Europeans nodding along and accepting the official narrative, millions of them started asking questions. Why is our government so focused on controlling what we can read? Why are they more concerned about online speech than about the issues we actually care about, like migration, energy costs, and economic stagnation? And why are unelected officials in Brussels making decisions that affect our daily lives without ever asking for our input? These aren't radical questions. These are the questions ordinary people ask when they realize the system isn't serving them. And the EU's aggressive move against the platform isn't suppressing those questions, it is amplifying them. Hashtags calling for reform of the European Union are starting to trend. Support for free speech candidates is surging. And across multiple countries, citizens who have never been particularly political started speaking out, not because they are loving the platform, but because they are recognizing what is at stake. This is what happens when you try to control speech in the digital age. You don't silence people. You radicalize them. You don't shut down debate. You drive it underground, where it becomes angrier, more conspiratorial, and far harder to influence. The EU thought a massive fine would assert authority, Instead, it revealed weakness. It showed that the Commission fears open conversation more than it fears public backlash. And once people see that fear, once they realize their government is afraid of what they might say, the dynamic shifts entirely. Which brings us to the American reaction, because this didn't just stay a European story. Within hours of the fine being announced, American officials started responding. The Secretary of State called it an attack not just on one platform, but on all American tech companies and the American people. The U.S. ambassador to the European Union said the fine was the result of regulatory overreach targeting American innovation, and made clear that the Trump administration would challenge burdensome regulations aimed at U.S. companies abroad. An Undersecretary of State went even further, calling the Digital Safety Act a blunt instrument of political control and financial extortion, and argued that the people most hurt by these punitive fines are everyday European citizens because the fines kill investment, crush business confidence, and drive innovators away. And then came the policy response. The United States government officially decided to stop issuing and renewing visas for European citizens who work in censorship-related fields. That includes people involved in fact-checking, content moderation, trust and safety, or anything related to combating so-called misinformation or disinformation. The message was clear. If you're working to censor Americans, you're not welcome in America. This dynamic should feel familiar, because we've seen this movie before. During the Cold War, the United States spent enormous sums defending Europe from Soviet aggression. We stationed troops, funded military alliances, and essentially underwrote European security for decades. And we did that because we believed Europe shared our values: freedom of speech, democratic accountability, the rule of law. But what happens when Europe stops sharing those values? What happens when the same continent we're defending starts fining our companies for refusing to censor our citizens? That's the contradiction at the heart of this entire situation. America spends somewhere around $50 billion every year helping to ensure European stability and regional defense, all at the cost of the American taxpayer. And in return, Europe uses regulatory power to punish American innovation and undermine American principles. It's not a sustainable partnership. And the Trump administration's response makes clear that the days of pretending otherwise are over. But here's the deeper point, and it's the one that really matters for understanding where this is all heading. The fine isn't silencing anyone, it's activating them. Across Europe, people are flocking to the very platform the EU tried to punish. They're joining not because they necessarily agree with every post or every user, but because they recognize that a space where you can speak freely is rare and valuable. And once you experience that freedom, once you see what open conversation actually looks like, it's very hard to go back to environments where every word is monitored and every opinion is filtered. This brings us to something much bigger than fines or regulations or even individual platforms. This is about Europe itself and the civilizational crossroads it's facing right now. Because the debate over this fine isn't really about data transparency or blue check marks. It's about European identity. It's about sovereignty. It's about whether the nations that gave birth to Western civilization can survive the decisions their leaders have been making for the past several decades. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you talk to everyday Europeans, not the politicians or the bureaucrats or the academic elites, but regular people in towns and cities across the continent, you'll hear the same concerns over and over. They're worried about migration, not because they're hateful or closed-minded, but because they've watched their neighborhoods transform almost overnight. They've seen their schools overwhelmed. They've witnessed crime patterns shift. They've felt their cultural traditions marginalized in the name of inclusion. And when they try to talk about these concerns publicly, they're told they're spreading hate speech. They're worried about economic stagnation. Energy costs have skyrocketed because of policies that shut down reliable power plants in favor of sources that can't meet demand. Businesses are leaving because the regulatory burden makes it nearly impossible to operate profitably. Young people can't find work. Retirement systems are straining under demographic pressures. And yet, when citizens try to debate these issues, when they question whether the green transition is being managed competently or whether mass migration is economically sustainable, they're accused of spreading misinformation. They're worried about democratic accountability. They watch as decisions that fundamentally reshape their countries get made by people they never elected and can't remove from office. They see the European Commission override national referendums. They watch as concerns raised by millions of voters get dismissed as populism or nationalism, as if caring about your own country's future is somehow morally suspect. And when they find spaces online where these frustrations can actually be voiced, where they can connect with others who share their concerns, suddenly those spaces become targets for a regulatory crackdown. This is what the fine is really about. It's not about making the internet safer. It's about keeping a lid on conversations the establishment doesn't want to happen. Because those conversations are dangerous. Not dangerous to public safety, but dangerous to political stability. Dangerous to the narrative that everything is fine, that the experts have it all under control, that ordinary citizens should just trust the process and stop asking inconvenient questions. The problem is, the lid doesn't fit anymore. The pressure has been building too long, and attempts to force it back down only make the eventual explosion more dramatic. Now, inside Europe, something remarkable has been happening over the past few years. There's been an awakening. Country after country has seen the rise of political parties and movements that the media labels as far-right, but which are really just advocating for what would have been considered mainstream common sense a generation ago. Controlled borders, national sovereignty, free speech, democratic accountability, the preservation of cultural identity. These aren't radical positions. They are conservative in the truest sense of the word. They seek to conserve things of value that are being lost. And the fine is accelerating this awakening, because it makes visible what was previously invisible. It's showing ordinary Europeans that their concerns aren't being ignored by accident. They're being suppressed on purpose. The platform where they were finally able to speak freely, where they could share articles their newspapers wouldn't publish and videos their broadcasters wouldn't air, where they could organize and mobilize and push back against policies they disagreed with, that platform just got hit with a massive penalty specifically for refusing to help silence them. The response currently is powerful. Hashtags calling for the abolition of the European Union are trending across the continent. Think about that. Not reform, not restructuring, abolition. People are arguing that the entire project has become so disconnected from democratic principles that it should be dismantled entirely, with sovereignty returned to individual nations, so governments can actually represent their people. Now, whether that's realistic or desirable is a separate question, but the fact that millions of Europeans are even having that conversation tells you how deep the frustration runs. Support for free speech candidates is surging. Parties that campaign explicitly on protecting freedom of expression, on resisting censorship, on opposing the Digital Safety Act and similar regulations are gaining ground in poll after poll. And crucially, this isn't just young people or political activists. It's across demographics. It's seniors, it's middle-aged parents, it's small business owners. It's people who never thought of themselves as particularly political, but who recognize that something fundamental is at stake. Which raises an interesting question. What happens if major platforms decide Europe isn't worth the trouble anymore? What happens if the regulatory burden, the constant threat of massive fines, the pressure to implement censorship systems that violate the principles the platforms were built on, what if all of that becomes too costly? You might think, well, platforms need European users. They'd never walk away from a market of hundreds of millions of people. But here's the thing. Europe doesn't build these platforms. Europe doesn't innovate in this space. What Europe does is regulate platforms built elsewhere, primarily in America, and use the threat of market access to force compliance with rules that would never pass in countries with strong free speech protections. So if a platform calculates that operating in Europe requires abandoning its core principles, that the only way to avoid crippling fines is to become an arm of state censorship, then leaving becomes a rational choice. And if that happens, if major platforms start withdrawing or restricting services, or simply refusing to comply beyond the bare minimum required by law, who loses? It's not the platform. It's European citizens. They're the ones who get cut off from global conversations. They're the ones who get trapped inside information bubbles controlled by their governments. They're the ones who lose access to the digital public square. This is the innovation gap playing out in real time. You cannot regulate your way to innovation. You can't find your way to technological leadership. What you can do is create an environment where smart people want to build things, where risk-taking is rewarded, where success isn't immediately punished with regulatory backlash. Europe hasn't created that environment, and the result is that every major platform, every significant technological innovation of the past 20 years came from somewhere else, mostly from America, some from Asia, but not from Europe. And now, having failed to build, Europe is trying to control. It's trying to use regulatory power to shape platforms it didn't create, to enforce values those platforms don't share, and to extract revenue through fines that look an awful lot like taxation without representation. That's not sustainable. And the more aggressive the enforcement becomes, the more likely we are to see platforms simply stop trying to serve European markets in any meaningful way. And here's what's really significant about this moment. It's not just about one fine. This is a turning point for global free speech. Because what's happening right now is that the assumptions underlying internet governance for the past 2 decades are being challenged. For a long time, there was a kind of implicit agreement that platforms would try to accommodate local regulations, that they'd implement content moderation systems that kept governments happy, that they'd work within the system even when the system demanded things that made them uncomfortable, and in exchange, they'd get access to global markets and relatively stable operating conditions. That agreement is breaking down. And it's breaking down because the demands have become too extreme. It's one thing to ask platforms to remove illegal content. It's another thing entirely to demand they remove legal speech that's simply politically inconvenient. It's one thing to require transparency about advertising. It's another to demand access to private user data so government researchers can identify and pressure individuals. The line got crossed. And once crossed, once it became clear that compliance would never be enough, that the demands would keep escalating until platforms became indistinguishable from state media, resistance became inevitable. And that resistance is having ripple effects far beyond Europe. Citizens in other countries are watching what's happening and asking themselves whether their own governments might try something similar. Tech companies are reevaluating compliance strategies and asking whether cooperation with censorship demands is worth the reputational cost. Policymakers are being forced to choose sides, to decide whether they stand with free expression or with governmental control of online speech. This is one of those rare moments where regular people, not governments or corporations or international institutions, are actually shifting the momentum, and they're doing it simply by refusing to accept that censorship is inevitable or necessary or good. So what is the European Union miscalculating? They are making several critical errors, and understanding them helps explain why this is backfiring so spectacularly. First, they assumed that a massive fine would force compliance. They believed that the threat of financial pain would be enough to bring the platform to heel, to make it accept oversight, to turn it into just another regulated utility that processes information according to approved guidelines. But they misjudged both the financial resources available to resist and the reputational value of being seen as the platform that wouldn't bend. Second, they are assuming Europeans would side with their government over a foreign platform. They thought citizens would see the fine as protecting them from misinformation and hate speech, that they'd appreciate the Commission standing up to big tech. But that's not what's happening. Instead, millions of Europeans are seeing the fine as a confirmation of what they'd already suspected, that their government feared open conversation more than it feared any external threat. And rather than applauding the Commission, they started questioning its legitimacy. Third, they are assuming the United States would stay out of it. They thought this was a regulatory matter between the EU and a private company, that American officials might issue pro forma statements of concern but wouldn't take concrete action. But they are wrong. The response from the Trump administration was immediate and substantive. Visa restrictions for censorship workers, public statements framing the fine as an attack on American citizens. Clear signals that the days of quietly accepting European regulatory overreach are over. This is turning what the EU thought would be a contained regional issue into an international incident with serious diplomatic implications. Fourth, they are assuming that controlling one platform would be enough to control the conversation. But that's not how information works anymore. When you crack down on one space, people don't just give up and go home. They find other spaces. They build new platforms. They create workarounds. And every act of censorship, every fine, every attempt at control It teaches people to be more resourceful, more determined, more committed to preserving spaces where they can speak freely. The EU thought suppression would lead to compliance. Instead, it's leading to innovation and resistance. And finally, they are miscalculating the historical moment. 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, the strategy might have worked. People were less aware of how content moderation actually functioned. They trusted institutions more. They were less connected to alternative information sources. But we're living in a different era now. People have watched too many narratives collapse. They've seen too many things labeled misinformation turn out to be true. They've witnessed too many experts be wrong about too many important things. Trust in institutions is at historic lows, and not because of foreign interference or conspiracy theories, but because institutions have repeatedly shown themselves to be incompetent, corrupt, or both. So, when the European Commission says they're finding a platform to protect citizens from misinformation, people don't automatically believe that anymore. They ask, who decides what counts as misinformation? They ask, what if the official narrative is wrong? They ask, why are you so afraid of letting us make up our own minds? And those questions, once asked widely enough, loudly enough, persistently enough, they change everything. The European Union issued what they thought was a routine fine. What they actually did was expose the entire architecture of digital censorship that they'd been building for years. They revealed their priorities. They showed their hand. And in doing so, they triggered exactly the kind of public awakening they were trying to prevent. So here's what this all means going forward. The EU's $140 million mistake wasn't the fine itself. It was the assumption that power and intimidation would be enough to control how people communicate. That assumption is being tested right now, in real time, and it's failing the test. More Europeans are seeking uncensored platforms than ever before. More Americans are questioning why we're allied with governments that don't share our commitment to free expression. More people everywhere are recognizing that the fight over online speech is really a fight over whether we'll live in free societies or managed ones. And the biggest lesson, the one that matters most, is this. Attempts to control speech in the digital age almost always backfire. Because the harder you squeeze, the more determined people become to find spaces you can't reach. The more you punish platforms for hosting dissent, the more valuable those platforms become. The more you insist that only approved narratives can be shared, the more people question what you're trying to hide. If you found this breakdown helpful, if you believe people deserve to understand what's really happening, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me what you think about the European Union's $140 million mistake. Tell me whether you believe this is really about safety and transparency, or whether something else is going on. Tell me what you think happens next. Whether Europe finds its way back to democratic accountability, or whether we're watching the beginning of a much deeper break between America and the continent we spent a century defending. Because the more we talk about these issues openly, the more we share information and perspectives and ask difficult questions, the harder it becomes for powerful institutions to silence the conversation. And that's ultimately what this is about. Not one platform or one fine or one regulatory battle. It's about whether we're going to preserve spaces where ordinary people can speak freely, debate honestly, and challenge power without fear. That's worth fighting for. That's worth understanding. And that's worth talking about with your friends, your family, and everyone who'll listen. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking questions.